short link in case you want to see the past recordings. If you missed some of the interesting sessions and you would like to watch them, that's the bit.ly link, short URL. You can go and watch these videos. What's coming up next is next week we have an interesting topic on machine learning at scale with Apache Spark. Adi Polak, she would be joining us from the Israel, if I'm not mistaken. And then we also have Cecil Philip doing distributed messaging patterns the following week, and then IoT data architecture by Dave Clover. So we have quite a few sessions lined up. In terms of other user groups, what they're doing, Setu and Priyanka, they have been quite active in the AI and ML space. I've put up links to their upcoming sessions here. There is one scheduled for next Tuesday, October 20th, and there is also one following week. This Saturday, there is a session on Power Apps for kids. So if you have young kids or small kids, this might be interesting topic. And the data groups, they have been running similar sessions like we do. So there is the episode 12 of data sessions happening on next Tuesday as well. In terms of other events, other than the user group events, we have the .NET Conf or .NET Dev Summit scheduled for 31st of October. And there is M365 Developer Bootcamp in first week of November. And the 23rd and 24th, there is AOS Southeast Asia as well. Then this is the YouTube channel we have where you can find all the session recordings. So you can use this QR code. If you're not subscribed, I recommend that you subscribe. We have quite a good quality content here. And some of our popular sessions are listed as well. So you can use that same short URL to watch these recordings. Now coming to today's session, we have Christoffer Noring joining us from UK in London, and he's a cloud developer advocate. He'll be talking about infrastructure as code with Azure Resource Manager or ARM templates. I've put the social media handles for Chris here. I'll also put this in the chat window in case any of you would like to contact or get in touch with Chris later. Before I hand it over to Chris, here are some of the reminders. So please keep yourself on mute when the session is ongoing. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand feature of Teams, and you can unmute yourself when the Q&A is going on towards the end of the session. As Rivut said, this session is being recorded, and if you find these sessions useful, please help us spread the word on social media. With that, it's over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Nilesh. Let me just share my screen. There we go. First of all, thank you so much for the invite. Highly appreciated. I've been to Singapore in 2009, actually, and I love the place and hope I can return one day. Let's go over to the presentation. Right. As Nilesh said, my name is Chris Noring. You can find me on Chris_Noring on Twitter. I'm a cloud advocate with Microsoft. That means I am doing presentations such as this, but I also work internally with tools and create various types of content. Today's topic is infrastructure as code with ARM template. First off, if it's not obvious to you why you're doing infrastructure as code, here's a few motivational points. What we really need to realize is that the landscape have changed. We now have developers and operations working as one team. And when they're working as one team, they need to be able to communicate. And part of that is to use the same processes as one another. That means that infrastructure needs to be expressed as text files. Much like you express code as text files that you check into a repository somewhere. So, right. So when it comes to the way we work, we need to make sure that we are able to iterate our infrastructure in much the same way that we iterate our code. So when it comes to code, we author some code and we deploy it to a cloud or somewhere else. And after a while, we discover, hey, we want more features or we have some kind of bug fix that we need to do, at which point we change our code and we redeploy it. This is exactly the same behavior we need with infrastructure as code. We need to be able to iterate and change and make it better and add stuff or take away things. And part of this means that we need to be very frequent and very accurate when we deploy and redeploy. So we need the tool sets and the processes to kind of support that. As I said, infrastructure needs to be expressed as some kind of text file and need to be put on a repo and version, so we're able to see what we did in April and what we did in May and so on and so forth. There's also a very important mantra is that we no longer separate between this is what developers do and this is what operations do, but anyone theoretically on your team, even a developer or even a tester, should be able to deploy something in your product. And for that to be possible, of course, if it's part of your pipeline or it's part of your GitHub repo or whatever you're using, it's a good mantra to have, that everyone feels responsible for everything in the product. There are two very big ways that you can do infrastructure as code on Azure. The two ways are ARM and the other way is Terraform. Both are supported. I will be discussing ARM tonight, but it's kind of good to know that you have options, because you might have a cross-cloud solution in which Terraform is your only option because you don't want to write whatever files you have twice. So why ARM? There are a lot of benefits to using ARM. I mean, first, it's a first-class citizen on Azure, right? Most things, most resources, I think all resources can be encoded as some kind of ARM template. A template is the text file that describes your resource. So you have a declarative syntax. You're not meant to program, whatever you're trying to deploy, but you should be able to express, this is what I want. I don't care how you do it, and you just leave it over to that resource manager to do your work for you. There's also repeatable results as part of it. You should get the exact same results if you put forth the same template as you did before. There's also modularity, because as soon as we start to work with something that becomes big, we need a number of files and we need a way to kind of put logic where it belongs. We shouldn't put, everything in one massive file if our operation is fairly big. We need a way to link between files, and ARM definitely support that. You can extend ARM as well, and you can use, for example, PowerShell within ARM template, because sometimes you're not able to declare or express what you want with just the existing constructs. There's also built-in validation, and I will show that as part of an extension that's being run in VS Code, how you can get all of this validation. But there's also a validation that happens when you're about to deploy, and it tells you, hey, your ARM template is wrong, and please fix this because I won't be able to deploy this. There are other things such as track deployment. It keeps track of everything that you've deployed, and you can go into the portal and see exactly what's been happening historically. There's also policy as code. You can, if you work at a big company, you are likely to have a lot of policies, a lot of rules and checks and balances that says, hey, you can do this, but you can't do that. And it's kind of nice if you're able to encode those rules. We also have support for that. And we have deployment blueprints. There is a huge repository of various samples of things that you can deploy on Azure. So you don't have to do this from scratch or spend a lot of time in documentation and find out how do I actually deploy a SQL Server or storage account or a key vault, for example. And of course, there's the authoring tools, which I will be showing you quite a lot of, actually. So you see you have all that support, and you should be fairly quick and accurate in what you do. So this is an ARM template. First time you see an ARM template, you see a bunch of JSON and you're like, wow, that's just a lot and I can't see what I'm looking at. But as you work with it, you will actually become familiar what these various constructs mean. And hopefully after today's presentation, I will have shed some light on what these things are. But this is never the way that you're actually faced with it in VS Code or whatever environment that you're using to view your template. You have color coding, but I just want to stress it's okay if you feel intimidated by this, because it's a lot of JSON, it's a lot of text. So if you have this feeling of sending help, the help is there in the form of extensions in VS Code. Now, Azure Resource Manager, this is a extension that I highly recommend if you're going to be the person who's going to author or update templates in any way, shape, or form. You have snippets, you have editing capabilities, you have a language server, so it's going to point out what's correct and what's not correct. And you have two different ways actually that you could be deploying your template, which is either PowerShell or Azure CLI. I highly recommend installing the Azure CLI as well as the PowerShell extension, so you have the option to select first-class support when you author and run your commands. Now, as I said, we looked at this JSON blob and you're like, wow, this is just too much. But the fact is, there's just a few constructs. So as long as you learn to recognize those constructs, you will see, this starts to make sense to me. So the constructs that you have that I'm about to explain to you is, first off, parameters. This is like an external parameter that you can send into the template. Variables is more like an internal set of variables that you could be using throughout your template to make it easy to not repeat yourself. And there's also a bunch of user-defined functions that you could use to operate on your data. So most things you can imagine that you want to do, there's always already a function for that. Then you have a resources item, which is a list that holds all of the resources that you mean to deploy. And then you have the outputs, which is a section in the template that says, well, this is what's going to be the return value or values of your template operation. So these are the basic 5 topics that your template consists of. Deployment. I think I mentioned this, but I'm going to say it again. There are 2 ways of which you can deploy your template. One of them is PowerShell, and the other one is Azure CLI. You will see in Learn modules, you will see in docs how there's always these 2 accents of 2 languages that you could be using to do the same thing. And we want it that way. We want to make sure that all of you who love PowerShell, you're able to do so and use it. And all of you who use Azure CLI, you can use that as well. Now, this is what a very bare template looks like. Yes, this is a valid template. So let's examine what it is. I mean, if you're looking at it, you see that it has a schema, some kind of schema, so you know what rule sets that it abides by. There are a few allowed schemas that have different versions. And when I say versions, the date here after the schema's property is what kind of changes. It could also have a version to say, hey, this version supports this and that element. And then you have the resources array, which is where your resources are. I said that this is a valid template. You can actually deploy this. But some of you may think, why would I have an empty resources array? That doesn't make any sense. I want to deploy something. But you can deploy this. You can, and I'm going to show you what that does. But first off, let's just define what a deployment operation would look like. So what I'm doing here is using Azure CLI, and I'm calling the deployment group create command. And then I specify a name for my template. I specify the resource group I want this to end up on. And lastly, I specify the template file. And this is just a path to your template file. So it might not be in your local directory, but somewhere on your machine. Before that, I have defined a variable template file to point to Azure deploy JSON. Azure deploy JSON is one of 2 allowed names that serves as an entry point for your template or templates. I should say that your operation when it comes to deploying is usually a bunch of different files, but there is one starter file that kind of links into all the other files. So what goes on? Sorry, my machine here is temporarily thinking. Okay, so I've gone through all the different variables. So what actually goes on under the hood? Well, this is being translated. So your command in Azure CLI is being translated into this REST command. So it's doing a put towards a certain URL. I don't think the 2 exactly matches, but the point is there is a translation happening, and all of the parameters that you specify gets translated into a request body, and off it goes to Azure, and Azure says, oh, okay, I know what to do, and thank you for this body, and I'm going to make sure that this becomes a deployment. So next thing to happen on the portal side is that we here if we look to the right, we see that we will actually get a deployment. So as soon as it's done deploying, it will update here and say deployment 1 succeeded, or 2 succeeded, or 10 succeeded, depending on how many times you have done a deployment towards a resource group. So you can always go into the portal and find out what happened after my deployment. But as you're running Azure CLI or PowerShell, you will be told in the terminal as well how things went. So, but it's always nice to have this visual overview of what's going on. You can click into your deployment, and this is what you're going to see. So if we're starting here on the left, you can see that it's going to specify things in different categories. So it will tell you an input, it will tell you an output, and the template itself. So if you click the template, you can see this is what you actually sent to Azure. The schema, the content version, and an empty resources array. And yes, again, it is perfectly fine to send it nothing. It doesn't make any sense business-wise, but Azure, is not going to complain. Were you to click inputs and outputs, you can see whatever inputs you sent to the template and whatever outputs that it returned as well. So you can be investigating these various categories in your own time if you want to. Right. This is maybe a bit more of a realistic looking template. This actually has a resource in it. It is a storage account. And so we look at the resources array. We see that we have a type. We see also that we have a location, in this case, ECOS, for example, but you need to be, or you should be specifying a location that's close to you because, well, it makes a lot of sense for in terms of how fast you can access a resource in the cloud. And also it has a SKU, so you know how much you're paying for this resource. It's kind of good to know what you've been specifying here in case you're on a SKU that costs too much. You might want to change that. So let's have a look at adding a resource. So we're inside of VS Code here. I just want to stress that we're inside of VS Code. We have installed the extension for ARM template development, the one called Azure Resource Manager, and we're about to actually author our template. What we don't want to do is to remember a lot of details on what a single resource looks like. So we want to be using some kind of snippet. Let's see here. So we have parked ourselves into the resources array. We have a file here called add resources JSON. And next thing we want to do is to right click, because we have the capability now. The snippet is smart enough to realize, hey, I'm inside of a template. So I select insert item. As you can see, there are a few different categories here: resource, function, output, parameter, and variable. And you want to be selecting resource at this point because that's what we want to insert. This is pretty much every single resource on Azure, almost, that is supported. So you can, for example, select a storage account, in which case you get this snippet. So most of the work is done for you. It gives you a name, it gives you a type, an API version, all of these things. And yeah, it even gave you a call to a template function, which I will talk about later. For now, I'm just going to be removing that and replace that with a static value. That's definitely not a best practice. I just want to make sure that you learn things in step. So imagine that you've gotten all of this for free just by using the extension. And you can imagine yourself that authoring is pretty quick if you can rely on snippets. And here I'm also showcasing how you would be deploying this. I think I showed this in the previous slide, but it's good to repeat it. I defined this variable resource group. It's called ARM demo. And the reason I'm calling it ARM demo is if you look at the top, you can see that I've been creating a resource group previously. And I just want to make sure that whatever I'm deploying ends up on that very same resource group. And you see how I've specified also all of the different params: the name, the resource group, and the template file. And template file being, our JSON file. So hopefully that was a good first explanation of our very first template, and definitely how you should be leveraging the VS Code extension. Right. Let's talk about input parameters, because you're likely to be using those. So far, I just authored this JSON thing. I didn't take much help from the outside other than specifying a name for it and so on. But we could be sending things into the template. And the reason why we want to be using parameters is that imagine that you're checking your JSON file into a GitHub repository. You don't want to be checking it in with secrets, right? If you have any secrets such as API keys or passwords, you want to be sending those at deployment time. So if a person actually gains access to your GitHub, you haven't revealed any secrets about your company. We use parameters by having a parameters section. In here, we have a parameter called storage name. It also has a default value that makes sense. So default value is what it's gonna default to if you don't specify it at deployment time. So you don't want this to be a secret, but something, you know, reasonable. And here you can also see how we could be using a parameters. Look at the top here, how we're using it by these square brackets, and we call parameters, and then we say within parameters we specify storage name, and this is how we are kind of referring upwards and saying this parameter, I want to use this value. So you might be setting the name for the resource, or maybe a display name, depending on what you're trying to use it for. Let's show that actually in code. It's always easier if we're inside of an editor to kind of grok what I'm trying to show you. So sorry, I had sound on that one. I just want to make sure that I'm talking to it. Right. Okay, so we're inside of our JSON template. We have a parameter section. We have the SKU. It's of type string, and it has a default value, which makes sense, which is premium LRS, which is a allowed value for SKU. That's all good. And here we are referring to it by saying the SKU for this specific resource is using this parameter SKU. So this is how we kind of avoid to have static values, because for different environments, for development, for maybe a prod environment, you might have different values, and using parameters is an excellent way of doing so. So here we are specifying the use of SKU by saying, hey, I'm sending through a value here. And that's pretty much how you would be using parameters throughout your template. As for deploying your template at this point, it's the same MO, the same way of doing it as before. We're just specifying in the parameters section, the -- parameters, that we have a parameter name equals a certain parameter value. Right. It's also good to specify allowed values. So allowed values within a parameter is like a validation operation that happens. So if you were to send something from the outside, such as a bogus value that doesn't make any sense, or you misspell something, you can actually be caught, and it says, hey, I need to have a value of standard LRS, or be called premium ZRS, for example. So if you know that a parameter value can only be a set number of values, specify the allowed values to kind of ensure that your template is not going to fail upon deployment, or it does something that it's not supposed to do. Template functions. Template functions are awesome, and there are a lot of them, which is why I'm specifying a link here so you can have a look. What these functions do for you is that they look up values, or they do computations, or various other things that are very, very helpful as you author your template. Here you can see the usage of a template function called resource group. Now, resource group refers to the resource group that you are deploying to while you are deploying. And as you can see, we can operate on the result, which is an object, and do dot location. So first off, we invoke the function with resource group parentheses, and then we do dot location, and it's quite powerful. I mean, there are tons of other functions that you could be using, but the fact that you have the ability to either check up your deployment while you're deploying, or you try to, I don't know, do a concatenation of strings or whatever you're trying to do is really powerful, and it makes it a lot easier to author. Let's have a look at how you could be adding a template function to your template. Just make sure. There we go. Okay, so here we have our template again. We are going to be using a template function. So we want to do that, and I'm just pointing out the location here because it's already using one. It's using the resource group .location. I just want to type this in slow motion so you see it. So here you have the resource group, and as I start typing, it gets auto-completed. So if I were to use something else than resource group, it would show up here, and it would give me this name of it so I can complete it, but also on the right, it would show me a description of what this function does. So I select the correct function for my scenario. See if I can jump a bit. Okay, so I'm using the resource group with parentheses, and then I know that I'm operating on a result, which is an object, and that object contains a location. So that's how I would be doing it. Just highlighting the resource group that it actually points to, which is ARM demo. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's talk about another concept which is very similar, which is called variables. So variables is more like an internal facing, and when I say internal, I mean inside of the template facing type of variable. So parameter is something that you can set from the outside, whereas the variables only exist on the inside. So here we use it to create this unique storage name, which could make a lot of sense because you want to name your resources in a good and predictable way, because you might have domain rules within your company. So you might want to say, based on an external parameter, plus a unique string, then I create a resource called something, right? This is good to ensure that you don't have name conflicts when you create your resources, but also that they abide by a company policy. So we use concat to kind of concatenate the two different values here. One from the external parameter and the other one from the unique string. And yeah. You can see that the end result of doing all this is a unique name for a resource each and every time we try to use it. So that's good. Unique string, I should just emphasize that this is creating a randomized string for you. So as for using it, you can see that I'm using it by using a construct variables within my resources to just say, hey, I want to be using unique storage name to set this resource name. Let's have a look at the demo of this one as well. Okay, we have our template. We see that we have in resources here, we see that the very first entry is already using variables. It's using unique storage name. What we want to be doing, oh, sorry, it wasn't running. So here we have a variable section. So the variables is defined. It's called unique storage name. It's defined as the concatenation between the external parameters and the unique string result function. And the unique string function takes some kind of input in. In our case, we are giving it a resource group ID, so it has something to randomize around. And yeah, so once we have created this variable, we are free to use it wherever we need to in the template. Let's see, do we have any other? Okay, so I could be creating another variable like so by just saying, hey, here's a new variable temp. Just a heads up, never create a variable called temp. This is just for demonstration purposes. I'm sure you understand that bit. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about output. So outputs is a part of our ARM template, which is the end result of our operation. You will see this in the terminal as you run the template that, oh, something came out of it. And you will also be able to see this as part of Azure Portal, where you to go into the portal and verify the same thing. But you can set up and you can define what the ARM output should look like. So you have an output section in your template. So here we have defined a variable called storage endpoint, and we're also saying it's of type object. So what we're doing is to use one of these template functions called reference, and it's talking to a unique storage name. And so we are actually getting the name of our resource, and we're asking for it to output the primary endpoints of this resource, which could be useful were we to deploy this resource, and maybe we want to put that as part of a secret inside of a, let's say, .NET web app, because it makes sense for us to know where to go when it comes to endpoints. So let's say that our .NET application has a bunch of images that we have stored on a storage account, and we want to know the URL for this, right? So we have the reference, and we have the primary endpoints as the thing that we are trying to return. So let's have a look at the demo for this as well, how we could be doing this. Okay, so we have our output section. We have created this storage endpoint part, and we have something specified of type object. It could be of different types. It doesn't have to be object. It could be a string or a number or so on. But because we know that we are talking to a resource, which is a big complex structure, we need to say, hey, you are of type object. And then we need to set this value property, and we do so by calling reference. And reference in turn takes variables as input, and within there we specify the primary endpoints as the thing that we want to actually return. So yeah, you can see how everything we've been doing so far is kind of connected. Everything from creating a variable to actually making it part of an output, and yeah. Okay, so if we're not happy with all the template functions that ARM is giving us currently, we could be using user-defined functions. And these are functions that we define inside of a template. So what we're doing is to create this section inside of the template called functions. And we can give it a namespace. In this case, I've called it utils. And then we can say, hey, you have a number of parameters that I call you with. And each parameter has a name and it has a type. So the name in this case is in, and the type is a string. And the output is simply the body of the function in which we specify what should happen. So value is where you specify the function's logic. So what we're doing as part of this function is to concatenate my company together with parameters in. The only thing I want to emphasize here is that parameters is not the parameters, the external parameters, but rather the parameters within our function. So that's kind of good to know. I wish they had a different name for this one to not confuse it with the other one, but know that parameters in here can only refer to what's going on inside of the function. So in this case, it's just saying, hey, I want to take the input parameter name. I want to concatenate that together with a static string. So namespace, name for a function, define whatever parameters the function needs, and some kind of behavior that the function has. And let's see how we can define that and refer to that in code. Okay, so we are back in our template again. Let's see if we can skip this a bit so we come to the interesting part. Okay, oh, we're too fast. So what we want to do is to scaffold the function, and we again use our extension. We start by specifying a namespace. If you look here at the top, so we call this namespace utils. After we have selected our namespace, we need to specify the name of the function. So we try to give it a good function name. We can always change this after the fact, but let's give it a name for now. Name is not a good name, but I think I'm getting my point across. And we want to specify the type of output and the name of a parameter. I mean, we could always be adding a number of parameters, but let's just create a parameter for now. And let's specify the type of the parameter as well. So you have this wizard, you have this dialog that takes you through a scenario of doing all the different things that you need to create that function. So you are left with a scaffolded functions where you kind of need to specify the logic only. So if we go down here, we can see in our functions section that we have gotten a namespace, we've gotten a name for the function, and we have gotten a parameter and also an output section. And the output section kind of begs for us to implement it, because right now it only contains, well, nothing. If you look at output value, it contains nothing, right? So what we want to be doing is to ensure that certain parts of this is being implemented. And it's also telling us that util's name is never used. So here's a very good thing that the extension for ARM is helping us with, is telling us what we haven't been using, regardless of whether that is parameters, variables, or functions. So it kind of keeps track of us and have these squiggly yellow lines to tell us that, hey, there's something you need to do here. There's something with your template that's not quite right. So let's try to implement this function. We could use the concat method, for example. There are other types of functions. I just want to show you the principle. And remember now again that parameters is only referring to things that goes inside the function. It can't refer to anything outside of its environment. It's not the same as parameter storage prefix. So the thing that it can refer to is the one called resource. And again, it's telling us if we are misspelling things, but it's happy with our spelling of resource. We want to concatenate this with something, so we combine parameters resource with maybe some kind of static string if we want to. This is just showing you for demo sakes. This function probably wouldn't exist in the wild, but I can imagine that there are quite a few computation functions that might be unique for you that you want to author. So we have a logic here. We have a function that's up and ready. So we can invoke util's name. And this time around, we can send something into it. And we need to populate this resource input parameter. And we can do so by, for example, talking to variables. So we take the value of the variables from a unique storage name and we send that into. And the result is being assigned to the location property. So here you can see how custom built functions that only make sense for you and your company can be used inside of a ARM template. Let's see. Okay, I want to show you or talk about something that a colleague of mine built, and it's called the ARM template viewer. He's a CSA, a cloud solution architect based in UK, actually, same country as me. Ben Coleman, he built this ARM template viewer. You can download that, install it as an extension for VS Code, but it's also now part of the portal, if I remember correctly. This is very, very good extension that is good at visualizing your template. So the scenarios for using this template viewer extension is at development time, but also after the fact. So while you're authoring, it can definitely tell you whether your template is wrong or not, because if it's wrong, it's not going to show anything. So once you corrected your template during authoring, you can see, I actually get something in this template viewer. Or you could take a pre-existing file that you found out of GitHub and say, oh, what is this thing deploying again? Because one of the first things I told you about ARM templates is that they're JSON and they might be hard to overview what's actually in this template and how do things relate to one another. Template viewer is the answer to that question. So here you have a JSON template on your left containing various resources, and it's able to actually show you here on the right in a very simple to grok manner. Oh, I consist of a website, an Azure function, a database, a storage account, and even a workflow. So what was once obscured in JSON becomes very, very simple and clear with these icons here to the right using this viewer. So I highly, highly recommend that you install that if you have and are using VS Code. There's also another one that I found there on the interwebs, internet, called armviz.io. This is also a very good viewer that could easily view and show how your various resources are connected to one another. So here you can see on the left how we have our resources of various kinds, and on the right everything is made super clear exactly what this resource is and how it connects. And it's also really easy to use. You just have to vary between these two icons. Okay, so I've told you a lot of concepts. It might be hard to know where to start though, because if you have an operation today where you either haven't used Azure before or you have used Azure but you haven't used infrastructure as code, you're like, okay, where do I actually start with everything? Well, start thinking about authoring and using VS Code, and start using these extensions that I'm suggesting to you, and your life will be a lot simpler. But you might have another question. I have a lot of existing infrastructure. What do I do with that? Well, you can actually export a lot of your template from the Azure portal and export it as JSON files, and you can say, oh, this is what I have actually deployed previously. So I can take all of these previous deployments and say, oh, okay, I can keep working and building on this. You also need to think about strategy. How do I want to deploy? Do I want to have a master template with a lot of linked templates, or do I want to organize my template in a fashion where I deploy things by product, everything that belongs to the same product, which might be a Azure function, an app service, and a database? Should all of those go into a template? And we can't, as Microsoft, tell you how you run your business, but we can only suggest. So you could organize by product or by tier or however you want to do things. That's really up to you. Excuse me. As I said before, you can take your existing infrastructure, go into Azure portal, do export template, and the end result of doing that is the JSON template. And you can put that into a file that you can version in GitHub and keep working on it inside of VS Code. Right, this is one of the most important things. So if you've been asleep so far into the talk, this is where I really want you to listen. There are two different modes when it comes to deployment. You need to know the difference. If you've done wrong here, you might have lost the entire setup of your cloud resources. So this is why I'm really saying, listen. Two different modes. The default mode is something called an iterative mode. And that means that every time you specify a template, it adds or tries to change whatever is there. Think of it as a patch in code. And you can even combine this iterative mode with a confirm with a yes or no. So if you feel like, for example, it's about to change a storage account and you're like, no, that's not what I want to do. If you have this confirm flag, you can just hit no and it's going to stop the deployment process. So it's good to know that there is a confirm switch. The other mode, which is danger, complete mode, will actually erase everything that's not inside of your template. And a pushback from you all might be like, why do you have this complete mode if it's that dangerous? Well, it's actually about what infrastructure as code is. So if you think about it as being this state, that your template files are your complete state every time you deploy, then you could actually quickly look at your templates and say, oh, this is everything that I have inside of my cloud. So if you can just look at GitHub and quickly say, I understand exactly what's in there. There's a storage account, there's a database, there's an Azure function, there's all these things, virtual machines. But again, realize that complete mode means that what you don't specify in your template will be erased. So that's why I'm saying iterative mode is the default we use. Complete mode is something that you actively need to switch to. So know that you're in danger land when you're going into complete mode. It makes sense to use it if you have a cloud operation where everyone's on the same page, but it's also dangerous. Okay. Let's talk about something called ARM preview. This is a thing that you should be using before each and every deploy, in my opinion, because preview effect enables you to actually say beforehand, hey, what's about to happen if I were to try to deploy this template? Well, there's a flag that you could be using to actually say what if. So the answer to the ARM preview is to use a flag called what if as part of a flag when you try to deploy, and it will actually list, I will add this, I will remove that, and I will update this. This is how the what if flag works, and this is a thing that should be in your backbone when you do any kind of deployment. Always see what's about to happen before you do it, because once you do it, it's done, right? Another thing I want to talk about, and this is near and dear to my heart, and the reason for that is that I've been authoring a Learn module recently that has just been published 2 days ago, right? It contains information on what if and the ARM template test toolkit, or the GitHub repo is called ARM TDK. It's a CLI tool. It's written in PowerShell. It allows you to run tests on your template, and it guides on good practices. We try to avoid using the word best practices because people are going to say this is not best practices, but best practices is what you define it to be and your company defines it to be. So we can only tell you these are good practices according to Microsoft, but it might not be the best for you. Except for running a bunch of tests on your template and say, hey, you're following this and that guidance, you can also author custom tests. And custom tests are awesome because you're able to say, I got a few scenarios that is very specific to my companies. How do I encode those so that this CLI tool runs those as well? I will show you just that. So let's have a look at a demo, first off, using the ARM TDK. And here we see that we have an Azure deploy JSON on our computer. And what now? Because I'm on a Mac, I open this PowerShell shell. And once I've done that, I can actually set and import the module. So I need to have done a GitHub clone. I need to have picked down ARM TDK from GitHub first. Once I've done that, I do import module. And just as a heads up, what I'm doing here is to point out the location of the ARM TDK module. So I give it the full qualified path all the way to this module, so PowerShell knows about it and is able to use it. Let's continue that. So once I give it this qualified path, it's ready to go. So I have imported the module. The next thing I want to do is actually to run my test. And I do that with test AZ template, and I specify this template path flag, and I give it a location of my Azure deploy JSON. Luckily, it's right there. But if it was somewhere else, I would need to specify the fully qualified path. And now it runs a bunch of tests. Everything in green has passed and everything in red has not passed. And you can also see the plus and minus flags here to indicate success or failure. So it's telling us that I have an unreferenced parameter. That's not good. I have something in my template that's not used. I should have a look, right? So I go inside of VS Code and I see, tailwind location. It has this yellow squiggly and it's telling me you have this parameter that's not used. You should clean this up, which is what I'm doing. So I'm cleaning this up and I'm running the tests again, and everything is green. Happy days, right? I've fixed the issue that I had in my template. But as you can see, there are also a bunch of other tests that you could be running as well. You can author your own test, as I said. If you have your own business and you're not happy with the test that we have given you from Microsoft, then you can just add your own. Let's have a look how you would do that as well. So here you're inside of the ARM TDK. You have cloned this from GitHub. And if you drill into the ARM TDK subdirectory, then into a subdirectory called test cases, and then inside of something called deployment template, you see all of these tests that we have authored for you. But you could also be adding your own test. But looking at this is just PowerShell code. And if you're a bit savvy in PowerShell, you can see roughly what goes on. In this case, it iterates over a bunch of references. It's running this regular expression, and it invokes this command let write error if something is wrong. And this is when you see like a red error output. Custom location, that's something that we wrote. So we're going to expand the visuals here so you're able to see what we're doing. When I say we wrote, that means I wrote it. So I have a parameter here that takes an input, and I iterate through all the different resources that I have in my resources array, and I check the location. If it doesn't match Western Europe, I'm actually telling it the location needs to be in Western Europe because could be legal reasons, right? Why all my resources needs to be in one region. And so this is how I would author my own test. It's a good tip to actually have a look at the various different tests, how they're written, so you can get a good clue and good head start. So here you see that custom location passes. The reason is that there are no resources, but once I start adding a resource, it will actually start to verify this. So let's define a resource by hand. Usually you don't do that, but you actually use these snippets that I showed you previously. But let's say we do this by hand for once. So I give the name property, I give it a type, and the type could be anything. I mean, we don't really care at this point, right? The only thing we want is a resource that has some kind of location. So we select the type. Once we've selected the type, we go on to specify a version. We can give it that too. And as you can see here, the extension is quite nice to us. It's giving us all of these valid values, so we never have to guess what these values should be. But as I said, let's go to location and let's actually create a failing test, right? We want to make sure that our test actually detects when we try to deploy something in West US instead. And yeah, we need to correct my service. It's still not happy, so I think I need to just lose the space in the name. There, happy days. I save this and I try to run these tests. I do so, and if I scroll up a bit, I see that my custom locations say, hey, this is not West Europe. So if I change it to West Europe, I can just go in, save this, and rerun this tests. And the end result is a passing test. So now you can see how easy it is to add your own custom logic that only makes sense for your company while using the ARM-TDK testing tool. That was a lot, right? You had no clue about ARM before, and now you're like, wow, I need to watch this video in like slow motion on 25% speed. That's perfectly fine. All of this will distribute it, as Nilesh was telling you. Here's a bunch of really useful links. Introduction. There's also a really brilliant tutorial that I think you should all take. I think it's a 7-step thing on our docs. There are various sections that I think is good to drill down into, like template functions, how you would link your templates if you have a lot of templates, which you tend to have if you have a complicated setup. How to test your template. I showed you that in the video, but this is the GitHub link where you can git clone or download the testing tool as a zip file if you want. What if is this preview thing that I talked about roughly. Policy as code is maybe something that could be of interest to you because companies have various policies and could be good to know how I can verify these policies. And here, you're actually a world first as a user group to know about this. I plus a few of my colleagues have been working with the ARM engineering team to actually release these templates, Learn modules to the world. So we are about to release a ARM template path. You're the first user group in the world to know this. So we have in stealth mode deployed part 1, part 2, part 3, and we're about to deploy part 4 to learn. All of these 3 links here at the bottom work, and they cover how you deploy, firstly, and then how you work with template variables and functions. And part 3, the one that I wrote, is about how you could be testing your modules using the what if operation and the ARM TDK testing toolkit. So now you know. Now you know. Go tell the world and go start using these learn modules. And if you want to reach out and say, hey, Chris, I got feedback for this. Can you fix this and that? Or why don't you cover this scenario? Or here's a spelling error. You have someone you can talk to on Twitter that's happy to hear all of your feedback. So I hope this was interesting, and I hope you feel excited about ARM template, about the extensions we have, and all these learning resources that we have. So in summary, we need to deploy infrastructure as code with our application code. All of this we've been talking about is called infrastructure as code. ARM and Terraform are the 2 major languages or dialects that we support on Azure. ARM is a first-class support. You can deploy ARM templates using either PowerShell or Azure CLI, and you can author your ARM template with Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. Please use the extensions for PowerShell, for Azure CLI, and for Azure Resource Manager. It will make your life a lot easier if you have all these squiggly lines indicating when you do wrong, all of these sample code that helps you easily to build out your template. So now I'm actually gonna leave over power here back to Nilesh, and I thank you so much all for your patience, and I hope you were able to listen even though it's late evening in Singapore.
Thanks, Chris. It was quite interesting. We have some questions in the chat window. I'm personally excited to see the testing toolkit coming out, because I think that would definitely help many people who are trying to write ARM templates and to validate them as they are developing it. So let me just read through the first question. I think both the questions are more or less similar, but the wording might be slightly different. So the first one is from Rivut, and he is saying infrastructure as code cannot be compared with development, because once you have applied IAC and created resources, the moment we need to apply changes, some resources will need recreation. So how do we avoid resources recreation in future?
Oh, that's a good one. Let me think about that one. So the problem is that okay, you have a resource, you don't want it to be recreated, you want it to stay the same. Or is there an update to the resource? I'm just trying to understand here, because normally when you deploy a template, right, if you've done a change to the resource, it will kind of recreate it, but make sure that the resource is still there. But if it wasn't there before, it will create it from scratch.
Yeah.
But you're
okay.
Okay. So the yeah.
Okay. So actually, right. Imagine we have a very limited subnet size, right? Let's say I size my subnet wrongly, or because of the other policy limitations, we cannot ask for big subnet. But then, few years later or few months later, we realize that we need to increase the subnet, right? So if we have that kind of situations, the subnet needs to be recreated, destroyed, but cannot be automatically updated, right? So that's a cannot. So in fact, if we compare to the development, we sort of thinking that is it possible that there will be an automatic migration from old subnet to the new subnet, whatever it is, that it becomes a seamless and allow the IAC to recreate without really destroying what has been deployed. I think that's
so. Okay, if I echo back your question, you have two versions of subnet and you're trying to use the new one, and it's very destructive when it tries to update, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think I need to take this question back to engineering. Is there any way you're on Twitter or have an email so I can reach out to you?
Yeah. I am on Twitter, and I'm also email. I'll check my email and Twitter to you.
Yeah, so if you reach out to me on Chris_Noring, I have open IMs. So definitely, if that works for you, I'm happy to take that question from there. I want to make sure that we know about the scenario or can give you a good answer back.
Okay.
So I think there was another question here. How could I make this deployment dynamic? I mean, use if-else condition for specific property. So there is the condition property that you could be using for Boolean logic, but it really depends, because if you have a case where, let's say you want to deploy an Azure Key Vault and you have a bunch of child resources, you might rely on the iterative nature of ARM templates instead, right? Instead of the complete mode. So you might rely on this mode saying, hey, this doesn't exist before, let's create it. So in that case, you can encode an if as saying this resource doesn't exist, create it, and then you have used this depends on logic. So any child resources wouldn't be created before this parent is being created. So in that sense, you can use an if, but depending on how you express the if, it could also be suffice with a condition property, if that makes sense. But how would I know that my resource is provisioned in Azure through ARM? Yeah, so that's the declarative nature of ARM templates, because what you would say is that I think this resource needs to exist. That's why you mention it in the resources list. And if it doesn't, it will create it. So as for a function that checks the state, you could, if you really need to know whether something is in there to be able to do logical decisions, you could actually involve PowerShell inside of the ARM template and actually do various lookups towards your installation of your resources. It's not a scenario that we recommend firsthand, but that's definitely a secondary option if it depends on and relying on the iterative nature, it doesn't work for you. I hope that answered your question, Pramod. Okay.
Yes, there was one more question before that from Chaitanya. He's talking about Logic App deployment, and he says, I used ARM template deployment to deploy Logic App, and object ID is attached to it. So when the same Logic App got deployed again, the object ID got changed. So is there any way we can use ARM template to modify Logic App definition without impacting the object ID?
I don't believe so. I would like to change the question somewhat because I would like to know more. So I'm trying to understand whether you need to operate on the object ID within the template or you need to know it outside. So there's like an application that refers to this object ID and that application needs it to not change. So I'm just trying to understand the situation because if you only need to use it within the template, then you can actually use a combination of a template function and the name and actually get out the ID. If that makes sense. So you could actually find. Yeah.
Hi, kids. This is Chaitanya. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. We use Terraform actually, so which refers to this object ID. So that's why I was referring to this object ID. So when this object ID gets changed, right? So when the Terraform uses this IAM to set this IAM service principal like access policies and all, so it was failing then for them. So their request for us was to just use to set the definition instead of recreating the object itself completely.
So I'm kind of wondering whether you could maybe do either PowerShell command or Azure CLI command, right after you've done your template, or do it as part of the output and get the new ID and feed that into the template. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I can understand that what you're saying.
So yeah, I mean, as for that being the best answer, I need to take that question back to the engineering team as well to see could we actually lock, because it was a logic app, right? You needed to lock the ID if possible. I mean, I believe that you know how to solve it if you need to in a hackish way, right? Or
yeah, there was an alternate approach where we have used the easy PowerShell command. So the set easy definition logic app is there, so which actually sets the definition of the logic app. So that is a different command actually. So but we wanted to use this ARM template to do that, mimic that actually.
Yeah. Okay, so what I will do, Nilesh, maybe you can send me these questions and I can I'll do my best to note people's names here, but I want to make sure that I get back to you because
sure.
I would like to give a best practice.
Forward it back to you.
All right. I would like to give a best practice answer for this question because I do believe that you can solve it either with a PowerShell or ACCLI command and get the new ID and feed that into, the Terraform template or Terraform deployment. But you probably want a way where it doesn't change. Maybe it's solved with deployment mode, possibly. Are you using the complete mode, though, is what I'm wondering when it comes to your logic app?
Yes, I guess, but I need to check that.
Okay, so if you are using complete mode, that simply means that everything is being recreated from scratch all the time. It's a dangerous mode, as I said in the PowerPoint deck. It actually destroys everything. If you are able to work on an iterative mode with this, I think that's better, but I completely understand if you need to create it from scratch every time.
Yes.
Chris, okay. I had a question. You mentioned that there is support for Terraform and ARM templates, and these two technologies or tools, they are trying to achieve the same objective of creating infrastructure as code, right? Or describing in a descriptive manner what resources you want to create. So is there a recommended practice when to use ARM templates and when to use Terraform?
Yeah, so the base recommendation I give for Terraform is that if you know you got a cross-cloud solution, then Terraform is usually a good idea, because then let's say you're using AWS and Azure, then you can use the same language for both and you don't have to have this context switch. And so in that case, it makes sense. I've definitely seen people who are all in Azure to use Terraform as well. So it's really a personal preference as well, because JSON might get a bit wordy for some people. And, we try to support Terraform as best as we can. With that said, I don't know if you've told the group about this new thing that we have called Bicep, which is something that looks more like Terraform, and it's currently in an alpha stage. I can type the name down, but there's actually a GitHub repo right now. If you search for ARM Bicep, you can find something on GitHub and it will show you language specification, what that looks like. So if you actually want to go in a direction that doesn't look like JSON, looks more like Terraform, but still has the first class support of ARM templates, then Bicep might be for you. With that said, Bicep and ARM with JSON is expected to coexist for a very, very long time, and I don't see people showing using one over the other. We just want to offer you an option.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think Pramod has a question.
Right.
Hi, Chris. My question is, does Terraform support, as is Microsoft support, like ARM? It's a native support for ARM, but suppose if I use that Terraform as my native client for the Azure deployment, so does it support all of the features that Azure sponsored us?
I think it's always a game of catch up. We try to make sure it does. In my opinion, we do our utmost to make sure that it's a 1-1 parity feature-wise. But I think because ARM is our first one, we're always going to support this one probably a few weeks, months ahead, and Terraform is going to trail somewhat. But we definitely want to hear if there are scenarios that should be supported on Terraform that's not supported. So if you have that kind of feedback saying, hey, ARM supports this, but Terraform doesn't, please come back to me and I can bring that to the engineering team and make sure they fix it. Because that's why I'm here today, right? To hear feedback from you all.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any more questions in the chat window, and on the YouTube stream also there are no more questions. Is there anybody who wants to ask one maybe last question before we close?
I'm going to type a name here in the chat. Satya Vel, he's on Twitter. He's the PM on the ARM team. He definitely wants to hear from you. So if you follow him on Twitter and his flow, he will tell you about when he needs feedback, or you can just at him directly. He's very happy to answer any questions and bring that to the engineering team. So if you don't want to reach out to me, you can reach out to Satya, because he will definitely take your questions to heart and try to support all of your scenarios. So it's a different Satya. It's not that Satya, but this Satya is also awesome.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. I saw a tweet from Satya Vel recently that there was an email which was meant for Satya Nadella, which came into his inbox by mistake, and he was quite furious about it.
I have a colleague called John Papa, and he gets a lot of messages from Papa John customers, so I can see how that can happen.
Yeah. Okay, anybody has a last question before we close this for today? Tick, tick 1, tick, tick 2, tick, tick 3. Okay, so if there are no more questions, thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot for taking time out of your busy schedule and doing this wonderful session for our user group.
Thanks all for having me, and thanks for all the questions. And